Today I am going to teach you about the organizational model of mental health. After I finish my module, you will know what the organization model of mental health is. You will learn about the X and Y theory, identify its various assumptions and evaluate the pros and cons. You will also analyze how to use it in the community. Let me begin by giving an introduction to the history and background. This model focuses on managing change in group processes and team building among stakeholders in an organizational setting. There is not much literature on this model of community psychology in the professional literature. Organizational development is primarily an organizational model of community psychology as it is concerned with organizational transformation issues drawing from behavioral and social sciences. The organizational development theory is heavily based in the discipline of psychology. Given this theoretical context, I will explore OD as an example of the practice of organizational model of community psychology. Organizational development initially transferred applications of the T groups and encounter groups into organizational setting. Much of the earlier focus was on team building and group processes. As the practice of OD developed, social structures and systems were recognized as critical factors in organization change. The focus shifted from individual to group effectiveness. The current practice of OD is focused on meta theories and discourse analysis. Let me talk about the practice of the organizational model of community psychology. Frances Cascio in 1992 describes a multidimensional model of organizational change which she has used in work both in corporations as well as public institutions in Italy. The multidimensional model explores organizational effectiveness, taking into account its strategic dimensions, the functional dimensions, psychodynamic and psycho-environmental dimension. Now, this model recognizes the multiplicity of organizations and understanding which is critical for any effective change initiative to take place. The Zululand Community Psychology Program is an example of the practice of the organizational model of community psychology. The program, initiated by the University of Zululand, comprises a network of collaborating community partnership that meet regularly for the purpose of assessing and implementing organizational initiatives. Local industries are active participants in the programs with mutual benefits to all the stakeholders. The community psychology internships of the University of Zululand are conducted at the various partner companies who are responsible for the internship funding. In turn, they receive the services of an intern psychologist providing needs-based counseling and mental health education programs. Now, partnership centers have also contracted university psychologists and have also offered instruction at the university, thus ensuring mutual transfer of knowledge and skills. In the year 1946, a group of psychologists and educationists met at the New Britain's Teachers College in Connecticut, USA. The aim of this group was to develop techniques for educating people about the community and local relations. The leader of this group was Kurt Lewin, R. Lippitt, K. Benny, and L. Bradford. The basic skills learning technique developed under the leadership of Kurt Lewin had considerable influence in the development of organizational model of community psychology. This is a psychological approach to study the organization phenomena, has its primary interest in the description, prediction and explanation of behavior of individuals and teams in organizational settings in order to understand, influence, manage people, processes and outcomes in the organizations. Now, the two areas that have had immense impact on the organizational psychology were that of individual differences and social psychology. Approaches based on social psychology studied cognitive, affective and behavioral processes and their outputs such as attitudes, beliefs and evaluations at individual and at team level. The emergence of organizational psychology is linked with the Hawthorne studies and the writings of Elton Mayo, who interpreted that results from psychological perspective rather than industrial engineering perspective. Let me talk about the assumptions of this model. The organizational model has had majority influenced by the views of Douglas McGregor and his theory X theory and the Y theory. McGregor elaborated two opposite sets of assumptions about the employees. According to him, efficiency of the management in dealing with people is based on the ability of the manager leader to make correct assumptions about the employees. Now, what is theory X? This theory is related to functions on management. This theory holds negative assumptions about the employees, whereas management approaches is strict and autocratic. Now, what are the managerial actions? Management is responsible in directing people's efforts, motivating them, controlling their actions, and modifying their behavior to fit the needs of the organization. Management is responsible for organizing the elements of productive enterprise, money, materials, equipment, and people in the interests of economic ends. Without the active intervention of management, people will be passive and even resistant to organizational needs. Average man by nature works as little as possible. Most people lack in ambition. They desire security as their major goal. They dislike responsibility and prefer to be led. Most people dislike work as they have to be pushed closely, supervised properly, coerced, persuaded, and even punished in order to reach the organizational goals. By nature, men are resistant to change. They are gullible and not very bright, ready to be duped by demagogues and charlatans. Now let's move on to theory Y. An alternative theory of human behavior represents the democratic behavior, a democratic approach, and thus offers employees greater scope of creativity and responsibility. It makes positive assumptions about the employees. So it is also referred to as the humanitarian approach of management. What are the managerial assumptions here? Work is as natural as prey. Average human beings do not always dislike work. Attitude towards work depends upon the work-related experiences. Depending upon situations, work can be a source of satisfaction or punishment. Motivation occurs at self-esteem and self-actualization level, and also at the physiological and security level. Most employees are capable of using high degree of imagination, ingenuity and creativity in solving organizational problems. The task of the management is to arrange organizational conditions and the methods of management so that people can achieve their goals by directing their efforts towards organizational objectives. People can exercise self-control and self-direction to achieve objectives to which they are committed, threats and punishments are required. Now, what are managerial actions? Job enlargement requires responsibility among rank and provides opportunity to satisfy social and ego needs. Participative and consultant management, making employees part of the decision-making practices, and joint target settings and self-evaluation. Thus, the theory states that managers can yield best results by proper treatment of employees. Therefore, emphasis is laid on the personal growth as a means for achieving cooperation within the organization. Moving on to the challenges for the organizational model of community psychology. One of the major challenges of organizational model of community psychology relates to the definition of the community in an organizational context. In terms of OD practice, the client community is the team, group, division that seeks out the services of the OD practitioner. Now, in this approach, other organizational systems may be neglected because of the definition of the community based on the brief given by the OD or community psychologist. Often the issue of the organizational power becomes a critical factor in the implementation of organizational interventions. In many cases, the management of the corporate organization is the one that sources the community psychologist, pays them for the work done, and can be quite strong about their interpretation of issues and that their agendas are realized through the interventions. This power dynamic places definite challenge to the community psychologist, who is both dependent on the management for organizational entry and yet realizes that satisfying the management's agenda will be an unethical practice. What are the typical interventions that are offered? This model has evolved gradually into a collection of specific interventions that complement and reinforce each other. Integration of these interventions for an approach specific to organization is referred as organizational development. This process is carried out by either a consultant or a group of consultants invited by the organization to work for extended period of time. Next is the sensitivity training. Sensitivity training or T group aims to create an environment or a better experience in which an individual and the group become integrated harmoniously. It is a training attempt to make employees sensitive to each other. This method aims to improve the participants' empathetic feelings, and it is also called the laboratory training. This method has members who are brought together in a free and open environment in which they discuss themselves and their interaction process. The basic objective of this method is to provide the participants with the awareness of their own behavior and how others perceive them, thus resulting in increased understanding of group processes, better communication and listening skills, increased group cohesiveness, openness and development of specific behavior skills, and increase in tolerance of individual tolerance and improved conflict resolution. Moving on to survey feedback. The survey feedback method was pioneered by Floyd Mann of Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan in 1957. This design promotes not just utilization of survey information but also internalization of solutions derived from it. In globally competitive environments, organizations are seeking information about obstacles to productivity and satisfaction in the workplace. Survey feedback is a tool that can provide the type of honest feedback to help leaders guide and direct their teams. Obstacles and gaps between the current status quo and the desired situations may or may not be directly apparent. In either case, it is vital to have a clear understanding of the strategies for diagnosis and prevention of important organization problems. If all leaders and members alike are clear about the organizational development and changes, strengths, weaknesses, then strategies can be designed out and implemented to support positive change. Survey feedback provides a participative approach and enables all members to become actively engaged in managing the work environment. Let me now give you a flow chart of this model. First is to identify the project plan and objectives, then brief team leaders and employees, administrator survey, conduct interviews and focus groups, train leaders on facilitating team discussions, analyze the data and construct a report, provide feedback to leaders. Team leaders conduct feedback action programs. Leaders present reports on progress to the management and follow up by senior leadership to ensure accountability. These are the 10 steps of the survey process that I have told you. Another technique known as the coding system was developed by Bales in 1950 to study the interaction between individuals in the organizations. The coding system consists of 3 parts. The first 3 categories in the system covering socio-economic area, the next 6 instrumental or task-oriented and emotionally neutral areas, and the last 3 in the negative socio-economic and emotional areas. The advantage of the coding system is that an observer can record interactions between group members over a period of time, and the results can be determined in terms of common action patterns and role taking within a group. Next, I am going to talk about the organizational efficiency. Organizational efficiency is a vital factor to the effectiveness of the organization's acquisition of resources and the use of those resources to implement its plans, but is less important to the creation of those plans. Increased organizational efficiency makes implementation of both cheaper and smoother, but is less useful if the plan being implemented was a bad plan. For example, if a business is able to produce and bring to market winter coats at less cost than the competitors in tropical nations, that business is efficient. But the decision to sell winter coats in that climate was almost certainly foolish and misguided. Despite this, organizational efficiency is still important to planning because it enables plans that are otherwise impossible. For example, if a business competitor has an entrenched position in a market but is less efficient in producing products, that business can enter the market through selling its products at lower prices than it can afford because of its lower production costs. What are the factors that contribute to organizational effectiveness? Resources include both concrete items such as cash and more abstract concepts such as human capital. Factors that influence the efficiency of the organization's use of its resources can be both internal and external to the organization. For example, the quality of an organization's labor is often dependent in part on the general education of the region in which that organization is based. Quality of management is perhaps the most influential factor on organizational efficiency, since it is management that chooses how to implement strategic plans, including selecting what methods and resources to use and leading employees in order to make the most of their labor. In the final analysis, efficiency of an organization depends on the effectiveness in terms of inputs and outputs. Katz and Kahn in 1964 have suggested a formula for increasing effectiveness in terms of the ratio of the input to output in the organization. For example, effectiveness of police force can be calculated in terms of the ratio between the number of crimes committed and the number of arrests made, leading to prosecution and conviction. Let me do an assessment of this model. This model primarily and mainly concentrated on the interpersonal goals of an organization. This can be done in terms of inputs and outputs, or one can also say qualitative and quantitative aspects. But this model does not state or talk about its use in the community, which is a major drawback of the model. Another major concern of this model is the internal personal relationships in a specific situation. The assumption which relates to the employee-employer cannot be applied to the complex problems of the community, where the relationship among the people is much more complex. The T group requires open discussion of problems, which is not possible in India due to the culture. And there are some things that cannot be talked about in the presence of both men and women together, such as the issues like family planning. There's a need to talk about sexual matters. Here the organizational model fails. The T group requires a relatively homogeneous group to function, but this cannot be found in a community. Also, inter-organizational interactions, which is possible in the organizational setup, cannot be applied to inter-community interactions. This model does not deal with this aspect at all. Finally, this model does not talk about translating human relationships in organizational setup to extra-organizational community setup. Let me summarize. The basic skills learning technique developed under the leadership of Kurt Lewin had considerable influence in the development of the organizational model in community psychology. The organizational model attempts to improve organizational effectiveness through organizational development interventions. This multidimensional model recognizes that members of organizations are also members of larger social systems that impact their organizational role. The challenge of this model is the capitalistic value base that could well be served by creating more productive employees who are still economically enslaved. The two areas that have had immense impact on organizational psychology were the individual difference and social psychology. The X theory is related to function of the management. This theory holds negative assumptions about the employees, whereas management approaches is strict and autocratic. The Y theory is an alternative theory of human behavior which represents a democratic approach and thus offers employees greater scope of creativity and responsibility. It makes positive assumptions about the employees. This model has evolved gradually into a collection of specific interventions that complement and reinforce each other. These interventions are sensitivity training and survey feedback. There are several drawbacks of this model along with its uses as well.